In this module, we are going to discuss another front-end technology, which is cascading style sheets or CSS. So what is CSS? As I said, like CSS is another front-end technology that works on the front-end side or on the client side, which is a style language. There are many versions of it. The latest version, I believe, is the 3. So here in this module, we are going to cover just like the basics of this language, how to understand how does it work. We cannot just cover like every aspect of it, but it's not gonna be that hard. I already included on Canvas. There is a link of topics that you should do a reading for CSS, how it's used. And before we discuss how it's used, let's discuss why it's there, why we should use CSS. As I mentioned earlier in the previous module, we said like back in the days, HTML was the only language that is used for web or to create a web pages. So in general, back in the days, everything was all mixed up all together. When I say all mixed up, that means the structure of the web page and the style, or let's say the presentation of the web page, are all mixed together. Okay, then some people they came to like the development and they suggested to use a different way of just like splitting the architecture of the web page from the presentation. And they decided that to use CSS as the main presentation language at that time. Okay, so if someone asks you like why you should use CSS, because nowadays all the web applications, which is like follow the best practices, should not have any presentation on the HTML side. It should all be done through CSS. Even like if you wanted to control how the, let's say, the objects or the components are laid out on your web page, you should use CSS. If you wanted to just like create, let's say, a specific, let's say you want to specify the font size, or you want to add like a border to a table, then you cannot just like use it from HTML as it used to be. Now, in the modern days, or let's say the way it works, you have to specify all the presentation things through CSS. So how it's used? You create your own style, and you choose one or or more HTML elements. When I say elements here, I mean the tags, to apply this style to, or to attach or bind the style that you've written with the HTML tag. Then you choose how to bind the style and the elements on both sides. So we will see together how you can achieve that. But before we go deep into like how to bind these things together, we have to understand how to include CSS. As I said, CSS is completely different than HTML. So how to make them all work together? Okay, so in this case, there are 3 methods to create your own style, or to include your style in your project. So one case, which is like write in a separate style sheet, which has the CSS extension. So you create a file with any editor or text editor, and you save it to your hard disk with the extension of CSS. This is like the first way of writing your code, or your CSS or your style code. So another way, which is write it in the head section of HTML. As you may recall that HTML has two sections, one for the head and the other one for the body. So in the head section, you will write your style there using a specific tag for that. The last way to include a style, which is like we call it as a line style, which is gonna be on the tag level. So whenever you write, let's say, p tag or paragraph tag, there's, like, as I said, there's a core attribute which is called style. For all the elements or the tags in HTML has this attribute. So you're gonna write your style within the style attributes of the tag. Okay, so let's go with like the first let's say the first one, or the first method. The first method, which is the external CSS. Let's assume like one scenario before to say like why we always should use this method. Let's assume that you have a website. Your website has about like 200 web pages. Okay, and you are using let's say an old way of creating your web pages. When I say an old way, that you are mixing the structure or the architecture of your web page with the style. So a new manager came up to the company and asked you to change the font size of all the 200 web pages. What would you do? You would need to go through all the 200 web pages and change the font size of all the elements in that web pages. This must be like really time consuming, and it's an efficient way to manage projects. Okay, so CSS came to the scene to fix such a problem. So let's assume in the same scenario, you are creating, like, you are linking all the 200 web pages with just like one single CSS file. In this case, if you want to change one thing on the presentation layer, you should do like the changes on your CSS file. And since all the other files or all the other 200 web pages are linked to that file, then it's gonna take effect without any like needs to change any web page. Okay, that's why it's really important for you as a developer to understand what is the intuition behind why we should use CSS. Okay, so in this case, you creating a separate CSS file. As I said, like here in the first one, you create a CSS file in any editor and save it to your hard disk with the extension of CSS. Then include this file that you've created here to your HTML page. To include this external CSS file, we usually use the link tag, and the link tag should be placed in the head section of your web page. So for this tag, there are three main attributes that you should specify. The first one, which is rel or relation, which is, in this case, we are going to link our HTML page with a style sheet file. Okay, and here the type, which is like the mem type, which is in this case usually would be a text CSS, and the last thing, which is the location of the file that you want to attach to your HTML file. So for me, this is like the best practice is to include everything in just like one external file, and that's it. So in this case, in case if you need to change like something in your web page or in your web application, then all you need to do is just like modify this CSS file, and you should be good to go. So another way to write your style, which is like internal CSS, or some people you like to call it, they like to call it embedded CSS. In this case, you are including or writing your CSS within HTML file. But here's the thing, even though it's all written in just one file, it's still completely separate, because the presentation or the styling, it's completely isolated from the architecture of your web page. Okay, so in this case, if you are trying, like, if you want to use the internal CSS or embedded CSS, then you may write CSS code within HTML file, or let's say in the same file. To include or to insert your style or CSS code in HTML file, you would usually use the style tag. And here, please note that it's tag, not just like an attribute. Okay, because most students will get confused because of the name of the tag. But the thing is, usually you would need to create a style tag within the head section of the web page, and within like this area you should write your style. So the way it's working, like this: you create a tag style, and then you type in your style here in this area. As long as you want, it's okay. Why I don't like this way of creating CSS? Because if you want to change, if like let's get back to our scenario, which was about like we have about 200 web pages. If you want to change, let's say the font size, you would still need to go and change all the 200 web pages. Okay, so in this case, what's the difference? Why it's like we sometimes need to use embedded CSS? In this case, back in the days, in the first scenario, the specification of the font was based on the tag itself, not based on the whole web page. Okay, so without CSS, you would have like gone through all the elements. You have to check all the elements of the web page. So with using CSS, you will still need to visit all these 200 web pages, but at this time, you are not going to go through all the elements of HTML. You only need to go on the CSS code and change the things that you want to be like to change it. Then it should be fine and it should take effect. But as I said, for me, the best practice is to always use external CSS. The last method, which is like the inline style. In this case, you are attaching your style or typing your style at the tag level. So as you may see here, this is like the tag P, and this is the style. So your code of style should be placed in this area. And if you wanted like to go with this, let's say approach, that means the code here will be applied only for this tag. So in this case, what if we have another tag which we wanted to apply the same style here? So to answer this question, we have to create a duplicate of this one. So if you want to change later, if you want to change on one of them, you have to change everywhere. So inline style, it's like, don't just use it unless you really need it, because it's gonna add like more overhead in terms of the changes. If you want to do any modification in the future, it's not gonna be that easy. Okay. So when you are working with, like, since we have like many types of, or let's say many methods of including your CSS, there's a really tricky part here, which is the overriding rules. Sometimes it's really important for you to understand what do we mean by overriding rules. Let's assume that we have a web page that has all these three methods in just like one page. We have, let's say, an external file, and we have an embedded file, and we have, let's say, an inline style. The thing is here, always, the closest style to the tag will take effect. Why is that? Because the way it's working, it's going to be something like this. Let's try to write in here. As we know before, that this is the web page. When it comes to the rendering engine will read it line by line, this way. Since these two, the link and the style, will be in the section of, or let's say in the head section, that means it will be rendered before to arrive to the body, right? So if we have, let's say, a style sheet or some style with the same name, let's say we wanted to do a style for the paragraph. Let's say for the paragraph, we have the color of, in the external, we have this one, this color. And for the internal, we have this one. And for the inline, we have this color. So in this case, according to this like structure or this order here, if we have a paragraph here, it's going to take the latest one. If we don't have the inline style here, then the last one will take effect. As I said, the last one always will take effect. Why we said like the closest to the tag? Because always the last one of your style will be the one that it's on the tag level. Okay, I hope this like explains why. So when it comes to the CSS, there's a general form. If you understand this general form, then I don't think you're gonna have any problem to work with any project using CSS. Okay, so the general form is gonna be something like this. This is the selector. The selector means the way that we are trying to bind this style written here with which element. And we will see different types and methods of choosing the selector. But for now, let's say the selector here is how to choose which element to apply your style to. This is like the simplest form. So here, like after the parentheses here, we have the property or the property name that we wanted to assign, and this is like the property value. So let's see here in this example. Here I have the selector is the tag name P or paragraph, and the property name here is the color, which is used to define the color of the text. And here the property value is blue. Here in this case, if I have page that has like, let's say 5 or 6 paragraph, all these 5 or 6 paragraph will have the color of blue. This is like the general form. If you get this one, then you should be good to go. What if you wanted to add like extra properties here? Then you have to type the semicolon here and go to the new line, then write the second property, the third property, and so on. So as I said, like, what is a selector? Selector is the way that CSS used to bind a style with a specific element. There are many types of selectors, such as element or tag. Sometimes people will call it element, some people will call it tag, some people will call it type-based selector. Another one, which is the class-based selector. The third one, which is the ID-based selector, or the fourth, attribute selectors. Number 5, which is pseudo classes or pseudo elements or pseudo type selectors. Lastly, which is the combinator. So let's go with the first one, which is the type selector. So before we discuss like the selectors, we have to understand that in each browser there is a default let's say style for all the web pages. So so if you don't create any CSS, there is a predefined style that it's like part of your browser. Okay, this is really important to remember. So sometimes if you wanted to do some work, sometimes you might need to reset these defaults to be able to apply the things that you want to apply on your web pages. So the first type of the selectors are, or let's say they call it the type selector or tag selector or element selector. So the way it's working, we're selecting based on HTML tags. So if we wanted to apply the style we are going to write to a paragraph, then we should use the tag name paragraph. If we wanted to apply the style to, let's say, a table, then we should have written here, let's say, table. So in this type selector or in the element selector or on the tag selector, always the way that we are trying to bind is through the tag name. So the way it's gonna work, the rendering engine, when it sees something like this, when rendering the page, let's say, so let's say this is the page. When the rendering engine start to do the rendering here, whenever it finds P paragraph, then it's gonna apply this, let's say, this style to this one. So in this case, the rule here is this style will be applied to all the tags you have that match here. So in this case, if we write something like this for P, all the paragraph or the P tags would take the same style. Okay? So the second type, which is the class selector, which is, like, by the way, the most used selector in the big projects and in the modern projects. So this selector applies the style to all the tags that has a matching class name. You remember, like, when we discussed like the core attributes in the previous module, we said like one of the core attributes was the class. So in our style here, if we write our own style, then all the classes or all the tags that has the matching class name will take the same effects. So how to write a selector or class selector? Usually you will start the name with dot. So here, the class or the class selector is dot blue text. And to do the binding here between this style and the tag, we should specify the class blue text. As you can see, it's the same thing but without the first dot. So in this case, any class that has this one or the class name or the matching class name, it should have, let's say, the style written in here. Okay, as you can see here in the first div, we applied the blue text. That's why we can see this one here. Then in this paragraph, we also has the same class name. That's why we applied another paragraph here. But here in paragraph, we don't have any matching class name, right? So therefore, we are using the default style here. Okay? If, in this case, if we are using the tag name and we just like wrote P, then we would have this line in blue and this line in blue and this line in blue because it's all P tags here. But since we are using the class selector, then whenever we find the matching class name, then we will apply the style to that tag. Another common one, which is the ID selector. This selector applies the style to the tag that has the matching ID. As we said like before, one of the core attributes, which was the ID. So here, CSS is going to bind the style to the HTML tag using the ID. And it's important to remember here that according to the standards, the ID should be unique in the web page. As a result, ID selector as usually will be applied on one specific element only. You cannot have two tags or two objects with the same ID. This is like the standards of creating a web pages. So as you can see here, to define an ID selector, you would usually use the hashtag and the name, or let's say the ID. So here, since you are using this one here, the div blue text has the ID blue text. As you can see, these are the matching. Okay, therefore everything in between or enclosed in this div will take the effect of the style here. As you can see, this one and this one, or line number 16 and 17, will take the effects of the style of the blue text. Here, as you can see, if you write class blue text, since there is no class selector here that starts with dot, then there is no way that you can apply it on here nor in here. Okay? One thing I forgot to mention here, which was like in the class selector. Most of the time, you will see something like you will apply the first class, then you will find a space, another class, then a space, another class. That means you are trying a different, or you're applying multiple styles or multiple classes, or applying multiple class selectors on the same object. So for instance, sometimes you'll find something like this is the first class, then space, second class, space, third class. In this case here, when it comes, the rendering will do the following. We'll apply the style of the first one, then we'll take the second one, then it will take the third one to apply all these together. And this is like always the case with all let's say the selectors. You may use like multiple selectors, but most of the time you will see that people with who are using class selector would use like multiple class name. But since like in the ID we only have one, and the type we only have like the tag name, then we are not gonna use any additional let's say classes or something like that. Okay, so the attribute selector. So this selector is really used in real life, or at least I never like encountered someone who's like really using the attribute selector. Most of the time you will find people are using class selector. So in this case, this selector applies the style to the tag that has the matching attribute name. So let's say we have a tag and it one of the attributes, let's say the border. Okay, then we can apply this style to the tag that has a border attributes only. Okay, as you can see here, the way it's working, this is the tag name. You can type the tag name, and here is the attribute name. So in this case, the interpretation for this one is P is the tag name and the attribute class. The interpretation for this one is whenever you find a paragraph tag that has a class attribute, apply this style on it. So in this case, when like the rendering engine will start, it's gonna take it line by line, and it will stop here P. It will stop because here at the class I have to apply, or this is like a matching style. So I will apply this matching, or applying this style, because I have a matching between these two, or I have link between these two. Other than that, there's nothing else. Okay, so the pseudo class or the pseudo elements. This selectors apply the style to the tag that has a matching state. So to understand what do we mean by the state, let's say if we have like a list of students in the class, okay, and we want to, instead of just like list all the rows in the same color, we wanted to have let's say the odd rows with a specific color and the even rows with a different color. So this one is like what we call a state, because the state of the first row has a different state than the second row, different state on the third row. Okay, another example of pseudo classes or pseudo elements, which is like most of the time we see in the web applications, which is the hovering over the link. When like you see a link and you hover your mouse over this link, you see like the color is changing. This is like what we call it a state. Okay, so CSS offers like many predefined pseudo classes and pseudo elements. The most common ones are the ones that use with links, as we will see, and another one which is using the different color for rows in the table. So let's go with the first one, which is like the links. Okay, so the way it's written, the code here is we type the name of the selector first, then colon, then the pseudocode name. So in this case, like for the link, we usually have 4 states. The normal link color. Here I assigned like this is like I just like assigned the color of the normal link. When the link has been visited before, then we can apply different style to it. When this link is like or like the end user hovering over this link, then we'll have a different color. And when the user is about to click, then it will have this color. And it's important here to notice that if you wanted to do a pseudo classes, the sequence or the order of these things matters. So you cannot just like say, I will set the active before the link. You have to set it in this order. And here, you can just do wherever you want. Any type of styles you want to add, you can add. But for here, for the sake of simplicity here, I just like change the color. As you can see here, the color here is orange or dark orange. You might like notice that this is like the effect or the state of hovering here. That means when I take like this snapshot, it was like hovering over this, let's say, this link. Okay. So another example, which is the rows. So here in this case, I'm just like saying when the, let's say, the row is odd, or let's say 1, 3, 5, these things, it will have this color. I usually just like type the color because it's easy to follow for now. But as I said, you can just like create wherever. You can create as long as like as many as you want. Okay, so here these are some predefined pseudo classes that you can use. As you can see here, the output, the first one has the brown color, and the second one will have the blue one. If you have like more rows, it's gonna be like brown, red, brown, blue, brown, blue, brown, blue, this way. Okay, but as I said, like these two cases are the most common that you will find, but there's like a tons of scenarios that like you might find it in the future, but for now these are the main the two main things that you should consider. So another selector, which is the combinator. The combinator is like a way of combining multiple styles into the same one. So in some scenarios, you want to apply a style on one, or let's say on an element in a specific area instead of just like all the regions. So let's say you have a div or a layer, and you wanted to apply to, like, let's say some style to a specific tag within this area. Okay, and we will see it in a moment, but this is like just like one way of frame the combinator. Okay, so let's just like go try to understand what do we mean by that. So the combinator, there are many types of combinator. We have descendant selector, a child selector, adjacent sibling selectors, general siblings selectors. So in this code here, the combinator here, we know before that this is like just a class selector, right? And this is just a paragraph selector. So if we write something like this with the space in here between this selector and this selector, that means we are trying to apply this style to all the children and grandchildren that we have in here. All the lists of the children from this tag will take the same effects here. As you can see in this area here. Here, the second paragraph is not part of, or let's say it's not just like a direct children of div, but it's grandchild of the div that has a class div. That's why it's gonna take the effects of all, like let's say if you have 10 generation here, then the same thing will be applied to the 10th let's say tag chain here. So this one is another one which is like, by the way, this is like called the space or the descendant combinator, and this is like the children combinator. The difference between this one and the other one is this gonna take the effects of just the direct children. As you can see here, paragraph 1 is a direct children of, or a direct child to the div here, right? That's why it's taking this effect. But the second paragraph, it's not a direct child of the div that has the class name. That's why it's not taken the effects or the style of this class here. So to frame this one, the only thing that you should remember is when you are using the greater than symbol here, that means the direct children. Okay? When you are using the space, it means all the tags beneath this tag will take the effect of the style you are writing. Okay, so the last topic we have here is CSS box model. Most of the students who starts to work with CSS, they find really hard to work with the box model or to make up their minds about it. So when we have a page or a web page, let's say the border of the browser is the dotted lines here. Okay, when we are talking about the margin, we means the distance between our object or the border of our object to the edge. So in other words, we say the margin is the outer space between the object and a different object or different edge. Okay? On the other hand, when we say padding, padding is the space between the border of the object and its own content. This is the way you understand the box model. So the margin is the outer space and padding is the inner space you have in here. This is like the key things that you should understand about CSS box model. So by the end of this module, there's one more question, which is how to master CSS. The good thing about CSS is like the readability. It's super easy for someone, even like for someone who never exposed to, let's say, CSS code, should be able to understand what's going on with it. So for example, if we have something like see. Okay. So let's say background. I'm really like not that good. If we have something like this background, it's like super easy for us to understand, like based on what we see. We know that it's like this property is used to set the background. If we say like margin, that means this, let's say this property is used to apply the margin. If we say a text decoration, that means this is like this property is used to apply a specific decoration. Let's say remove underline or make it strong or make it italics, for example. Okay, so the good thing about CSS is the readability. It's super easy for you to read, and it's not that hard to read it, just like, and to understand, to figure out what kind of things that you are trying to achieve. Okay, so the thing here, to practice everything that we explained here. Try to do it as an exercise and push it to your CSS branch in your repository. If you come across a property that you don't know and how does it work, then check it in action. You have to do it in action. A little advice here is it's really good to use W3 schools when you are learning CSS, because you can see the code in front of you and you can try it out just like out of the box. So you can just like click there and you can just play with it in a little bit, then you see the effects, or let's say the differences that you made. But the good thing is, like, you might be good like practicing there. The bad or the downside of using W3 schools websites is if you did all your experiments there and you did all your exercise there, I will not be able to see like what have you done. So the thing is, go to W3 schools, try everything in there. I already posted like some of the reading materials for CSS. Try to apply all these things there. Once you are familiar with it, then replicate the things that you've done on W3 School's website on your code repository. This is like the only way that I can evaluate whether you've done like the work or not on your branch. As I mentioned with HTML, a cheat sheet is really good idea to keep things with you. It's really important. No one's gonna memorize everything. Then, like, since no one's gonna memorize everything, then you should be able to just like use this cheat sheet. There's a good interactive CSS cheat sheet that you may use. It's really good one. Let's discard this one. So let me show you here. So as you can see, this is like the CSS HTML cheat sheet, and this is like for CSS. So CSS cheat sheet, as you can see, everything you need is here. Everything. Even like if you want to do with color picker, you can just like try it from here. If you want to see like understand the background, or you want to understand the positions, you can do it. Here, let's say W3 schools. If you go to learn CSS, everything that we mentioned, you should be able to see things like this, and you can just like try it out here on their website. Let's say if you wanted to change this one here to, let's say, blue, then type your changes, then just to run, and you can see the results. But as I said, this is not enough for me to evaluate you as the exercise. Once you are familiar with all these things together, then you can just like create your own file and push it to your repository on the CSS slides.